Hey guys, this is Samuel, and I usually don't talk about books that I was forced to read for class because usually the only reason why people find books they read for class interesting is because they were forced to read them, and when you're forced to read something, you tend to justify that it's less boring in your head because it's just something you've been forced to do, so there's no way you can put it down and just forget about it, even though in most classes, no matter what you take them throughout college, you can kind of fudge reading it. But in this case, the professor, made us write memos on every chapter, thus forcing us to read it. But I'm in this book. I'm kind of glad he did. I have mixed feelings about this book, which I'll get to. But I think it's still an interesting read if you're interested in politics whatsoever, and that's The Spot. The Spot is a book that covers the history of politics from the history of political advertising, not politics, from the 1950s to the 90s. In fact, it has two of my favorite presidents on it, H.W. Bush and Eisenhower, and it talks about how they used advertising, how like advertising evolved through Madison Avenue to how the laws have changed everything and forced campaigns to adapt. It didn't get to McCain-Feingold, which would have been really interesting on how that changed advertising, but it doesn't get that far into it, into the history of it. But what it does do is it teaches you a lot about how advertising changed, and how advertisements are built, which I think is super interesting. Just from because I've been involved in politics, but it's mostly like been the grassroots stuff. Whereas this really dives into the more creative side of politics, and it talks about how a lot of these pivotal moments in political advertising came at like it evolved in the context of that time, and how the context of that time forced these people to move with their advertising changes. In fact, it references another book I was forced to read for a class, The Responsive Chord. The Responsive Chord is a book I will absolutely recommend anyone to read if they're interested in media in general, because The Responsive Chord is written by Tony Schwartz, who did some of the best advertisements of all time, in general, but also the best advertisements for Democratic politicians of all time. Like, this guy knew how media worked, and the book, The Responsive Chord, will teach you a lot about how media works and how it interacts with people. This guy was a genius. He understood things about how we interact with media more than anyone, and I don't even know how to describe it. The Responsive Chord is definitely a great book. Maybe I'll get into that one some other time. But this book is cool too. It breaks down a lot of the most famous advertisements by putting a picture and description. It also teaches you how to write a script. And because I'm in this class, political advertising, I have to write a lot of scripts for candidates, but it teaches you how a script is written, how it looks, like formatting, and it also teaches you, and it doesn't teach you like in a textbook way, like this is how a script is formatted. It tells you how the history of these famous political advertisements, and then it goes into and then it puts the script on screen as to provide context for the history. Unfortunately, in the later half of the book, it gets really preachy into the personal politics of the author. You can tell the author is liberal, and he just starts ripping into conservatives for certain advertisement choices that they made, and just editorializing a lot. But, most of the book is really good. I would say if you read chapters, let me look at the chapters real quick to tell you which ones off the top of my head. But if you read chapters 1 through 13, which is the first. He calls it like the first part of the book, which I think is interesting. If you read chapters 1 through 13, this book is really good as a good historical document. It gives you a great sense of political advertising. Chapters 14 through 16 is a lot of editorial, a lot of repetition from the previous chapters, and honestly feels like he wanted to make a thicker book, so he justified writing some extra chapters. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think this book would have been a lot stronger without the last two parts of the book. But I'm also a conservative, so I'm pretty, biased, I guess, towards, some of the things said in this book. I just see them differently than he does. But it like the rest of the book comes off as like a real historical, like pretty benign book that tries not to delve into the personal feelings about a lot of these politicians. It leaked in every now and there during the first 13 chapters, but in the last three, it really starts coming out. Like, to give you an idea of why I even say that, like the name of the 16th chapter was like The Trouble with Spots, and it gives like a lot of editorializing on why political advertising may be bad. But, I think that it's definitely something you should check out. It's definitely an interesting read if you're interested in politics at all. But it can be a bit, boring at times, in the sense that it goes over the same things over and over again. And I feel like in some of the chapters, some of the advertisements they pulled out, or some of the campaigns they chose to focus on, weren't as pivotal as the authors may have wanted them to be. And that's something you'd only get if you were like really deeply into politics. But like, let me see if I can find one real quick, because I did a lot of highlighting and stuff in the book in case you haven't seen it from the few pages I showed you. But like, well, I can't see it. But there was like some Democratic campaigns they chose to focus on in presidential primaries that weren't exactly pivotal, and I don't really understand why they chose those ads. And I do feel like there's other campaigns that they could have focused on, and some great ads I felt like they missed that they didn't put in either. So there's some missed opportunities I feel with this book. It is the third edition, so if you have a different version of the book, maybe you have some completely different things that I haven't seen, or if you have a newer edition. I'm cheap, so I went on Amazon and just bought a used version of the book. I didn't want to pay like $30 for a new one. I'd rather pay like $9 for a used one. It is a Massachusetts Institute of Technology book. Like they're the press that prints it. So if you ever wanted to check out the newer version, you could order it probably directly from MIT. But it's definitely an interesting book that I feel that you should check out. It really delves into the history of political advertising and a little of advertising in general. I am a geek about advertising. When Mad Men first came on the air, I got really interested in advertising when I started watching that show, and it kind of made me a geek about it. And I'm also a huge political geek, as you guys already know. So I definitely recommend a read through once, even though I was forced to read it. I still think it's a pretty good book on its own. However, if I had to choose between just this and The Responsive Chord, which I think is a much better, deeper dive and much more interesting book in terms of actually understanding advertising, I would choose The Responsive Chord. But if you really just want to know about, like, geek out about political ads in general, I definitely recommend one thumb through of this. It's kind of a dry read a second time around if you have to read a chapter over again. So you may want to see if your library has it, and you could just rent it from there. Or if you have like Amazon Kindle Unlimited, maybe it's available on that. But definitely an interesting read, and definitely not the worst book I've been forced to read in grad school or in undergrad. So definitely an interesting checkout. And I thought I'd share it with y'all here on YouTube. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys soon. Samuel out.